But Manchester United have got a big problem whilst they've got a star player in the dressing room whose agent is categorically going to go out night before the biggest game of the season and say he doesn't want to be at the football club. A lack of respect. The guy should never be dealt with again by this football club. This football club's got to stand still and look what's happening.
You want Haaland, don't you? So you're going to have to deal with him.
No, they can't go and sign another player with that agent. They cannot do that. They cannot do that. Enough is enough.
The Premier League is the world's most lucrative football competition, and many would argue the world's best league. However, for those inclined to look, there are signs of an implosion coming down the pipe, and the excrement is starting to hit the ventilator. Everton have been docked 10 points for financial infringements, while Man City and Chelsea both face charges. Clubs are used as financial and political vehicles by those able to afford them, and a recent Premier League vote on multi-club ownership has given the green light for this to become the norm. The continued influx of Premier League money has raised alarm bells across Europe, with footballing superpowers plotting a European Super League to maintain their standing. In an attempt to get some level of governance in the game, the government has stepped in and appointed an independent body to oversee the league, in the hope, I suppose, that it is still governable. But at the heart of much of this lie agents, greasing the wheels for the wider machine that is English football, particularly English Premier League football. FIFA recently attempted to impose rules to curb agents' influence, including capping the commission they can make. The fact that these rules were challenged and subsequently overthrown in Germany, then England, is telling. However, these proposed plans were missing the one key rule that would go a long way to benefiting the long-term welfare of the game. This is a deep dive into why introducing this one simple rule for agents would change the game for the better. Please do subscribe, like, and comment. This is all much appreciated and very helpful. But in the meantime, we will get into it. Let's strip this right back a second and understand three things that dictate how agents operate, namely, who creates the rules the agents must adhere to, how do agents get paid, and finally, what is the actual job of a football agent? Firstly, FIFA sets the guidelines on how agents should operate worldwide. It is then up to the national governing bodies to then stipulate the bespoke rules for that country within the framework FIFA originally set out, or more accurately, that FIFA tried to set out. So in the case of the English Premier League, this would fall to the English FA to confirm the final rules. Now, how agents get paid is crucial in understanding the influence they have and how they are incentivized. The details can get complex, but essentially there are a couple of things that are important to know. Firstly, no matter the terms laid out in any contractual arrangement, it will nearly always be the club, not the player, who pays the agent. This is done to take advantage of tax loopholes that exist when the club, rather than the player, makes the payment, as this is seen as a benefit in kind. Not only do the club make the payment for the agent, but often the agent gets paid to represent both the club and the player in the same negotiation. Sometimes the agent represents the selling club, the buying club, and the player. This is called triple representation and is one thing FIFA tried to outlaw in their recent guidelines that were rejected in England. Even if they had gone through, double representation would have been allowed to continue, meaning an agent represents both the player and buying club at the same time. If you're thinking, that seems like a conflict of interests, then it absolutely is. In fact, players must sign a waiver acknowledging this fact. This is a signal of the influence agents have and also the club's total reliance on them to get transfers done. Finally, the actual role of a football agent is described concisely on myfirstagent.com. Main roles and duties of a football agent include career management, transfer negotiation, contract negotiation, financial planning, sponsorship and marketing opportunities, public relations, disciplinary issues, welfare advice, cars, housing, banking, investment, etc. You will see that the role of an agent is designed to handle all other aspects of the player's career and welfare outside of playing the game itself. So now we have a general idea of how the world of agents is laid out, I will introduce the one simple rule that would protect the welfare of the game, both for the players as individuals and the wider sport. And that is, agents, or the agency they represent, cannot represent more than 15 players at any one time. Now, you may well be thinking, well, what good does that do? So I will explain, as the case for this is multifaceted. It helps to understand how agents often get players on board in the first place. The following is a regular scenario throughout the professional English Football League. A young player about to or recently signed a professional contract will be approached by a senior playing member of the squad, advising them to use the same agent they have and recommending their services. The young player, likely 17, 18 or 19, and not having much idea about this stuff, of course, feels confident, perhaps even privileged, about jumping on board. Of course, what the young player doesn't know at the time is that the senior player is on a commission from their agent to get more players. In other words, the senior player is not necessarily recommending the agent based on their ability to help manage their long-term prosperity, but for their own short-term gain. There have been occasions, no doubt, that this has served all parties well, but looking at the evidence generally, there seems to be an issue here. If we go back to our list of agent responsibilities and look at items such as financial planning, welfare advice, and career management, these things may as well not exist. In fact, the results are a full-blown disaster. Here are the stats. An estimated 40% of professional footballers go bankrupt within 5 years of retirement, and many more struggle financially later in life. The rate of marital breakdown amongst professional footballers is almost double the average. In fact, 1 in 3 will be divorced within 12 months of retirement. It would be difficult for anyone to make the case, based on these stats, that players have had their long-term interests catered for by agents who are paid to do just that. This is not helped by faceless agents being thrust upon teenage players without any due diligence. If an agency was only allowed to represent 15 players, this would cut this out to a large degree and perhaps force players to actively seek agents, perhaps using the FA, who provide agent services that mostly go unused. It also begs the question, if an agent is looking after scores of players, how can they really have the time to be doing what they are supposed to be doing in terms of a player's welfare and long-term outlook? However, in reality, this is just the tip of the iceberg. A second scenario to take a look at is how agents market their players and how they generate moves for them. The way we might imagine this would work is Club A wants to buy Player 1 and negotiates with Player 1's agent. An agent we now know is likely to be paid by the buying club, and very possibly also representing the buying club, the player, and potentially the selling club. With this leverage, the agent will often tout other players they represent into the deal. They may offer Player 1 to clubs B, C and D to drive demand, and then return to Club A and say, "We can talk further if you agree to also buy Player 2, now or in the future, and pay them X." This is the sort of thing that has become more and more prominent in the last 15 years, despite some very relevant dissenting voices. Here is a long but revealing quote from the allfootballapp.com. On August the 31st, 2014, Arsene Wenger went to sleep happy that Arsenal would be signing Radamel Falcao the following day. He woke up to discover Falcao's representative, Jorge Mendes, had in fact used Arsenal's interest as leverage to negotiate a transfer to Manchester United. Wenger got burnt and vowed never to deal with a super agent again. The appointment of Sanllehi, initially as head of football relations in 2017, spelt the end of Wenger's cast-iron grip on transfers at Arsenal. Sanllehi was brought to the club for his contacts book, or more pertinently, his relationship with some of the biggest agents on the planet. Times of course change in football, but when someone like Arsene Wenger voices concerns about the integrity of these types of dealings and has his personal powers stripped from him in favour of these types of transactions, it says something. It would be difficult to imagine Sir Alex Ferguson standing for this type of thing, and it was noteworthy in the Beckham documentary that of all the things that were mentioned in the lead up to Beckham's leaving the club, it was a disagreement about agents that was at the forefront. This was not just about Beckham's representation per se, but also about allowing a certain type of agent to infiltrate the club, something Wenger was also keen to safeguard against, noted again by allfootballapp.com. There was always a reluctance with Wenger to engage with super agents, even if it was to the detriment of their recruitment strategy. His concern was that once you let them in the door, you'll never get them, or their players, out. If we delve deeper into an example starting with Arsenal here, we can see how far the rabbit hole of multiplayer representation and influence goes. There were a few eyebrows raised when Cedric Soares was initially brought to Arsenal on loan in 2020, before being given a generous 4-year contract. This may just of course be because Arsenal wanted Soares and were willing to do what was required to get him. However, they also signed Willian and Pablo Mari at the same time. The connection? All three players were represented by Kia Joorabchian, who is known to have a very close relationship with Raul Cellini, Arsenal's head of football until 2020. Now, either Arsenal desperately wanted all three of these players who happened to have the same representation, or they really wanted one and others were leveraged into the bargain. Arsenal also signed another player represented by Joorabchian in 2019, one David Luiz. Luiz is a particularly interesting case when acknowledging the wider economics of top-level football, in particular financial fair play rules. Luiz was at Chelsea from 2011 to 2014 when he was sold to another huge spending club, Paris Saint-Germain, for £50 million, only to return back to Chelsea in 2016 for a reported £34 million. All these transactions took place during the prime years of Luiz's career. Straight away, there are a few things that don't quite add up about this. If Chelsea wanted to sell him, why buy him back 2 years later for admittedly less than you sold him for, but regardless, a very high fee? Also, if you're Paris Saint-Germain and you splash out a world record fee for a defender who is regularly playing in the team and is in his peak, why sell him back after 2 seasons? Both Chelsea and PSG were under scrutiny at different times from financial fair play, times that both coincided with Luiz's transfers between the clubs. This quote from We Ain't Got No History describes Chelsea's situation in 2014. While it is mandatory for Chelsea to reduce losses in 2013-14 to ensure that it remains compliant with FFP during the second monitoring period, the club will still be allowed around £38 million in total losses over the 2011, 12, 13 and 14 books. PSG, on the other hand, were under intense scrutiny a year or two later when they sold Luiz back to Chelsea, described here on ESPN. UEFA closed its FFP investigation into PSG on Wednesday after declaring itself satisfied with their break-even result for 2015-17. However, the club remains under scrutiny for transfer activity from last summer up to and including this summer's window, and their compliance with this year's break-even requirements. This might all be a coincidence until you understand what Chelsea was subsequently charged for and why they had a transfer ban put into place. This type of manipulation of funds via an agent was something Chelsea were doing legally until 2017, as ESPN goes on to detail here. This concerns Article 18b, which relates to third-party influence. That's the practice, which used to be legal until 2017, but no longer is, of entering into agreements with outside parties, usually agents, that influence how another club operates in employment and transfer-related matters. This is a clear concession, as you are likely to find, that this was indeed happening. The article also goes on to say, FIFA haven't gone into specifics on this. To juggle money in this way around any FFP rules requires an agent to facilitate such a deal. They would have to know what the clubs want, which they do because they are paid to represent them, and when they need it to happen. This is of course aided by triple representation mentioned earlier, something England will continue to keep. The more players an agent represents, the more control they have. The more control they have, the more they are relied upon to facilitate premeditated moves like this. Bear in mind, Premier League clubs have just greenlighted multi-club ownership, so the ability to dodge financial fair play rules has become greater, and multiplayer representation, as well as triple representation, may be a recipe for disaster as far as this goes. It should be said the Premier League had an opportunity to start to quell the influence of super agents such as Kia Joorabchian back in 2006-07, when the famous West Ham survival scandal arose, and they somehow managed to sign Carlos Tevez and Javier Mascherano. GiveMeSport.com describes this deal. Out of nowhere, then manager Alan Pardew announced on deadline day that the Irons had successfully signed both Argentine stars, causing the West Ham fan base to go absolutely crazy. It was a deal that was shrouded in mystery, and one that, as it turns out, was completely and utterly fraudulent. Essentially, Kia Joorabchian held the rights to the players. He had owned 51% of Corinthians via his company, Media Sports Investment, and when he sold his shares, he retained his investment in the two players and therefore was able, presumably, to offer their services to West Ham. However, all third-party ownership is strictly forbidden in the Premier League, so this was patently against the rules. But instead of docking West Ham points that would have relegated them, they were simply fined £5.5 million before agreeing compensation of £18.1 million with Sheffield United in 2009. While this is an admittance of guilt, a precedent had been set. To give an idea of the scale of multiplayer ownership by agents, Joorabchian's company Sports Invest is thought to have tens if not hundreds of players on the books, and in countries all across Europe. Transfermarkt.com gives the following stats, with CAA Stella thought to represent approximately 807 players at a market valuation of £1.89 billion. Unique Sports Group has 473 players, Wasserman from the US has 866 players, Sports Entertainment Group has 299 players, and there are many, many more of these companies. To sum up here, the game has a decision to make. It is clear that the financial and ethical values of the game in England, particularly, are at something of a crossroads. The influence of agents and the incentives they work towards help fuel the current trajectory of a game that some will fear is becoming unrecognisable. Quelling the influence in a manner such as this may be necessary to help preserve integral elements of the game for the decades ahead. Thank you everyone for watching this. Thank you for getting to the end of it. I hope you enjoyed that and that it makes sense. For those of you engaging with the content, liking, subscribing and watching these videos is really very much appreciated. Feel free to get stuck in the comments. It's great reading those and I answer them as regularly as I can. And I'll see you on the next one.